brought one of the most powerful messages in the Bible, the fall of Nineveh, capital of the feared Assyrian Empire. In a time marked by oppression and violence, Nahum was chosen by God to announce judgment against one of the greatest empires of the ancient world. While many feared the indestructible power of the Assyrians, Nahum was certain that divine justice was on the way. His story is a tale of courage, faith, and a powerful reminder that no kingdom, no matter how strong it may seem, can escape the hand of God. Nahum was born in a small, unknown town called Elkos, surrounded by hills and simple landscapes. From a young age, he heard horror stories about the cruel power of the Assyrian Empire. These accounts spoke of armies that destroyed entire cities, took families as slaves, and plundered mercilessly. The brutality of the Assyrians knew no bounds, and the people of Israel suffered under the weight of this constant oppression. With each news of new attacks, the population asked themselves, where was the God of their ancestors? Why did I allow evil reigns without being punished? Nahum, still a boy, watched the tired faces of his neighbors who could barely hide their fear and despair. He grew up in this environment of anguish, but also with a growing conviction that God would never ignore such injustice. As time passed, Nahum became a steadfast and silent man, reflecting deeply on God's role in the face of evil. He didn't know it yet, but he was being shaped for a mission much greater than he could imagine. It was as if the shadow of something large and inescapable was hanging over him. Then one day, Nahum began to have visions. They came like vivid dreams, showing the fall of mighty Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire. He saw the walls falling, the people fleeing, and the city being consumed by chaos. When he woke up, he asked himself, why was God showing him this? Nahum, the simple man of Elkos, would you be able to carry such a powerful message? And so his journey began. The visions that Nahum had did not leave him alone. He spent days in silence, thinking about what it meant. At first, he tried to ignore it. How could he, an ordinary man, be chosen to announce the destruction of a city as powerful as Nineveh? It was unthinkable. The Assyrians were feared by everyone. Its capital was surrounded by imposing walls. Its riches seemed infinite, and its army invincible. Who would be foolish enough to believe that this empire would fall? But no matter how much I tried to push these thoughts away, the visions came back with more force. Nahum saw fire consuming the city, heard distant screams, and felt the presence of something divine, something inevitable. He knew this was not a figment of his imagination. God was showing him the future. Still, the weight of this responsibility was crushing. He walked the streets of Elkos, observing the people around him, not knowing how to start. How can we say that divine justice was about to fall on Nineveh? There was also fear. He knew his message would not be well received. People might laugh at him, call him crazy, or even worse. But as the visions became clearer, Nahum understood he had no choice. He was not just a spectator. God had chosen him to speak. And at that moment, in a silent dawn, he accepted the call. Nahum knew that accepting the call was just the beginning. With the decision made, came the internal battle. He spent nights in prayer, seeking strength to carry such a harsh message. What God was asking of him was not simple. Preaching about hope and kindness was something people would be willing to listen to. But announcing the destruction of Nineveh, a city that seemed invincible, was another story. Many would see him as crazy or even as someone looking for trouble. I never felt the weight of this mission, and at times I almost faltered. He walked around the Elkos, trying to find peace, but the visions continued to disturb him. Every detail he saw was so vivid. The sound of the walls falling, the fire consuming the city, and the deathly silence that came after the destruction. The images were so real that, at one point, Nahum could almost feel the smoke in his lungs. It was during one of these walks, isolated in a field, that Nahum stopped and, with his eyes on the sky, asked for an answer. What should he do? God then answered him, not with words, but with a deep conviction in his heart. No matter how difficult it was, he must speak. Nahum was chosen to announce the fall of Nineveh, and nothing, neither fear nor doubt, could divert him from that path. Slowly, he began to prepare himself. He knew his message would meet resistance, but God's justice era right. And even though many didn't believe it, the truth was recorded in the visions he had received. The only thing missing now was the right time to speak. Nahum knew the time of silence was over. The message that burned inside him could no longer be kept. He started walking through the streets of Elkos, preaching about the imminent fall of Nineveh. At first, few listened to him. People hurried past, some just stopping out of curiosity. Who was this man who dared to speak out against such a powerful city? Nahum's words were strong, without hesitation. He spoke of God's wrath against violence and oppression. It told how Nineveh would be destroyed, its walls torn down, its riches plundered, and no one would escape divine judgment. People listened to him with expressions of disbelief. How could anyone announce the fall of an empire that seemed invincible? Nineveh was the heart of the known world, a center of wealth and military power. The idea of its destruction sounded absurd, but little by little, Nahum's conviction began to make an impact. Some, especially those who had suffered at the hands of the Assyrians, felt a strange hope in his words. Could it be true? Would God finally act against the city that had caused so much suffering? Even the most skeptical started to pay attention. Still, many doubted. Nineveh's walls were unbreakable, its army unbeatable. How could a man from a small town claim otherwise? But Nahum continued, unfazed. Every word he spoke seemed to fill the air with an invisible force. He knew that the time of justice was approaching, and what came next would be even harder to accept. While Nahum's words spread, the reactions were increasingly intense. Many began to be troubled by his message, and rumors of the fall of Nineveh reached the ears of important leaders. Some of them were alarmed, fearing that Nahum was sowing revolt among the people. Others believed that he was just another fanatic who over time would lose strength and be forgotten. But Nahum didn't. He was alone in his words. There was growing dissatisfaction among neighboring nations. Assyrian oppression had hurt many, and the idea that Nineveh would finally pay for its crimes began to resonate. Conquered cities, exiled people, and those who lived under constant threat felt the weight of imminent justice. Nahum spoke with more conviction every day. God will not let the violent get away with it. The people of Judah, although still fearful, began to see a glimmer of hope in the prophecy. However, while some listened attentively, others reacted with hostility. Nahum was confronted by leaders who saw his message as a threat to order. They feared that speaking out against Nineveh would bring even more retaliation upon them. And so, Nahum faced attempts to silence him. But as he was moved by a greater force, he continued. Even with threats to his life, he did not hesitate. Over time, his message began to take on reality. Whispers of internal weaknesses in the Assyrian Empire were spreading. Rebellions began to emerge in distant territories. Nahum knew that what was coming was much bigger than anyone could imagine. Nahum's message began to bother the powerful even more. Knowing that his words were reaching further and further, Assyrian spies were sent to observe him. There was growing fear that his preaching could instigate revolts and weaken the empire's control. It wasn't long before the Assyrians plotted to silence him once and for all. But strangely enough, Nahum always seemed to escape. When the soldiers looked for him, Nahum was one step ahead, protected by paths that no one else knew. It was as if an invisible hand was guiding him, freeing him from danger with each new capture attempt. Meanwhile, inside Nineveh, things began to fall apart. Political intrigues, betrayals, and corruption corroded the heart of the empire. Nahum knew that this was no coincidence. God was acting, and what he had announced would not take long to happen. Every week, news of more distant rebellions reached the people. Nineveh's allies, who once seemed unshakable, now started to turn against the empire. Nahum, with his attentive eyes, observed all this with the calm of someone who knew that God's plan was in motion. The visions that had previously caused him so much fear now made sense. He clearly saw the fall of Nineveh approaching, like a river breaking its barriers. Still, Nineveh maintained its arrogance. Its leaders believed they could contain any revolt, control any threat. But Nahum knew that destruction would come from where they least expected it, and that nothing, not even the city's great walls, could stop the approaching judgment. Within the walls of Nineveh, something began to change. What once seemed indestructible was now beginning to show signs of weakness. The rebellions that Nahum had foreshadowed were not just distant rumors, they were approaching, and the city, so full of pride, was beginning to feel the weight of the crisis. Intrigues took over the palace. Leaders brought us one another in search of power, and the people who had previously lived under the shadow of Nineveh's greatness began to realize that the end could be closer than they imagined. Nahum continued to preach, now with even more conviction. He spoke of God's justice, which fell not only on individuals, but also on kingdoms. Nineveh was made great by violence, but its time of oppression is coming to an end, he proclaimed. Many who previously ignored him now started to pay attention. The news from within the city was grim. Corruption was everywhere, and the armies that once protected the capital were weakened by infighting. But even with the clear signs of decadence, Nineveh still clung to its arrogance. Its rulers believed that with strategic alliances and promises of gold, they could maintain control. They sent ambassadors to negotiate with neighboring nations, trying to regain their strength. However, every plan seemed to fail. It was as if a curse was upon them, as if everything they touched was destined to fall. And Nahum knew that this was the hand of God acting. He saw in his visions the imminent fall of the city. But what he did not yet know was that the final siege was approaching, and Nineveh would face a fate far quicker and more devastating than anyone could have predicted. As Nineveh began to crumble from within, its leaders still desperately tried to maintain control. Secret meetings were held, and promises of alliances were made at any cost. Gold, land, even concessions of power, everything was offered to avoid the imminent fall. But as Nahum had already predicted, these attempts would not be successful. The heart of the empire was rotten, and nothing from outside could save it. Meanwhile, rebel armies began to organize. Nations that had long lived under the yoke of the Assyrians now saw an opportunity for revenge. Babylon and Media, previously enemies, joined forces, planning the siege of the great city. What seemed unthinkable began to take shape. The invincible Assyrian Empire was surrounded, and Nineveh would be the final target. The walls that many believed to be unbreakable now seemed like a prison to its inhabitants. Nahum, watching everything from afar, knew that the siege was just the beginning. He had seen in his visions how the waters of Tigris, which flowed near the city, would perform a crucial role in its destruction. It wouldn't just be the armies that would invade Nineveh. Nature itself would turn against her. Nineveh's days of glory were clearly numbered. But even with the armies around them and the natural forces against them, the leaders still believed they could resist. The siege of Nineveh had begun. The armies of Babylon and Media, now allies, surrounded the city with determination, ready to overthrow the one who had oppressed them for so long. The imposing walls, which once intimidated any invader, now seemed more vulnerable with each passing day. Inside, the despair became palpable. The inhabitants of Nineveh, once confident in the protection of their gods and their fortifications, now feared the worst. The food supply began to dwindle, and cries of anguish echoed through the city streets. Nahum, in his distant city, watched with a calm that only the certainty of divine justice could provide. He had seen it in his visions. The walls would be broken not only by the hands of men, but by the forces of nature. And that's exactly what started to happen. The heavy rains, which Nahum had predicted, caused the Tigris River to overflow its banks. The waters, previously calm, now ran furiously, threatening the city's foundations. The impossible was beginning to materialize. With the collapse of part of the walls, the enemy armies saw their opportunity. They entered the city with fury, destroying everything in their path. The great palace of Nineveh was sacked, its riches taken, and its leaders captured or killed. What was once the heart of Earth's most powerful empire was now nothing more than smoking ruins. The city that everyone believed to be eternal was on its knees, crushed by the invisible hand of God's justice. With the fall of Nineveh, a profound silence took over the lands around it. What was once a grand city, a symbol of power and wealth, was now nothing more than rubble. The invaders who had entered through the destroyed walls left carrying the gold and treasures, while the flames consumed what was left. Nineveh, which for so long terrorized neighboring nations with its brutality, had been completely humiliated. The fire, which Nahum saw in his visions, licked the skies, and the smoke could be seen for miles. Nahum knew that destruction was not just a military victory. It was God's justice, fulfilled exactly as he had announced. The prophecy that many doubted was now an indisputable reality. The people of Judah, upon hearing about the destruction of Nineveh, began to believe Nahum's words even more. The city, which seemed impenetrable, had been razed to the ground in just a few days. Those who suffered at the hands of the Assyrians now saw the empire crumble before their eyes. The fall of Nineveh echoed like thunder throughout all the nations. It was not just the end of a city, but the fall of an empire that for centuries ruled with an iron fist. Peoples who once lived in fear of the Assyrians now looked upon Nahum and his words with reverence. What he had announced with so much conviction had been fulfilled in a frighteningly precise way. Now he was no longer just a prophet. He had become the symbol that divine justice does not fail. Babylon, one of the forces that participated in the siege, quickly began to consolidate itself as the new world power. His army, led by cunning generals, took Nineveh's riches and expanded its domain. But something in Nahum's words haunted even the Babylonians. The same justice that had fallen on Nineveh could one day fall on any nation that dared to follow the same path of oppression. Meanwhile, other nations, who had been forced to pay tribute to the Assyrians, began to rise up. Revolts broke out in many corners, and the old order was completely destroyed. Each people now sought their own freedom, shaping a new political map.